All right, welcome back for another deep dive.
Yeah.
And today we're going to be looking at something
Oh, yeah.
that I think affects all of us,
For sure.
and something that is probably still affecting you today
Absolutely.
when you buy things.
Oh, yeah.
And that is Trump's tariffs.
Mm.
We have this great article here called Trump's Tariffs, Impact on China, Mexico, Canada, and Global Economy.
Yeah, a lot to unpack there.
There was a lot to unpack. So we're not just going to talk about like what they were, but really try to like get into the why it matters to you.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to kind of go through like the immediate impacts and then sort of the ripple effects in the years that followed.
Yeah.
And then even some of the potential long-term shifts in the global landscape.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to see how,
Yeah.
even though these are policies that are kind of aimed at a specific country
Right.
or a specific area, the impact is really global.
Yeah.
And it kind of cascades down and affects everybody in some way.
Exactly. So let's rewind back to the Trump era.
Oh, yeah.
The administration was really focused on two things:
Mm-hmm.
reducing the trade deficit,
Mm-hmm.
particularly with China,
Right.
and protecting American jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And their big move was tariffs.
Yeah.
So we're talking like a 10% tariff on a whole bunch of different Chinese goods, and then a 25% tariff
Wow.
on imports from Mexico and Canada.
And so, when we talk about tariffs, we're essentially talking about a tax on
Yeah.
imported goods. So imagine you're a business owner here in America,
Right.
and all of a sudden the cost of the steel that you need to make whatever you're making
Right.
goes up 25% because it's coming from Canada.
Yeah.
Well, that cost is going to get passed down the line,
Yeah.
first to you and then probably to your customers.
Right. And so you're already seeing like those price hikes
Right.
are like the first most immediate impact.
Yeah, absolutely.
And anyone who bought a car around this time
Oh, yeah.
might remember this firsthand.
Absolutely.
The tariffs on steel and aluminum actually led to car prices jumping by an average of $1,000.
Wow.
Yeah, that's not chump change.
No.
But more people.
No, and it's interesting
Yeah.
because the administration was arguing this would protect American jobs.
Right.
But like industries that were very reliant on imported parts
Right.
actually became less competitive.
Right.
You
Yeah.
could see this play out in data from the time China's soybean imports from the U.S. plummeted by 75%
Wow.
after they slapped retaliatory tariffs on American agricultural products.
Wow.
So it actually ended up hurting a lot of American industries more
Yeah.
than it helped.
So it seems like
Yeah.
it was kind of a gamble
Yeah.
that didn't quite pay off the way
Yes.
they hoped.
Yeah.
But beyond those immediate price hikes,
Mhm.
were there other ways
Yeah.
that these tariffs sort of shook things up?
Absolutely. So, all those global supply chains you hear about,
Yeah.
the intricate networks that produce goods and distribute goods across borders.
Yeah.
Well, tariffs threw a wrench in those gears.
Yeah.
Companies had to rethink where they were sourcing their parts from
Yeah.
to avoid these added costs.
Yeah.
We see this play out in various industries, like, for instance, some American tech companies
Mm-hmm.
that were facing tariffs on components from China.
Right.
They started looking to Vietnam,
Right.
Taiwan
Yeah.
for alternative suppliers.
So it's almost like
Mhm.
companies were playing a game of like
Right.
economic musical chairs,
Yeah.
trying to like
Find the cheapest place.
find the cheapest
Yeah.
and most stable place.
Yeah.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah. And then, like, on a macro level,
Yeah.
this reshuffling also contributed to a slowdown in trade
Yeah.
between the countries that were involved.
Right.
China, for example, actively sought out new markets, particularly in Europe and South America, to reduce its dependence on the U.S.
And American exporters who were used to selling goods to these countries
Right.
face more barriers
Yeah.
and lost market share.
Right.
So it seems like kind of a lose-lose
Yeah.
for everybody involved.
In many ways, it was.
What were some of the long-term consequences?
Well, one outcome
Yeah.
was the potential weakening of America's position
Right.
on the global economic stage.
Yeah.
So as countries started to diversify their trade partners and form new alliances,
Yeah.
the U.S. risks becoming
Yeah.
less
Essential to that system.
Right.
Right. So it's almost like
Yeah.
these tariffs
Yeah.
might have inadvertently paved the way for other
Yeah.
economic powerhouses like China.
It's a good point. And
Yeah.
it's something that
Yeah.
policymakers and analysts are still grappling with today.
Right.
While some American industries may have seen short-term benefits.
Yeah.
Particularly in sectors like steel and aluminum,
Right.
the unintended consequences like higher costs for businesses and consumers,
Yeah.
even job losses in certain sectors,
Yeah.
those were significant and,
Right.
and continue to resonate
Right.
even now.
So it seems like there's always this tension between the short-term wins and the long-term,
Yeah.
often unpredictable ripple effects.
It's so true. And with something as complex as the global economy, you really can't isolate
Right.
the impact of a single policy,
Right.
like tariffs.
Yeah.
It's a constant process of adaptation and adjustment
Yeah.
as businesses and governments respond to this.
Well, and speaking of adaptation,
Yeah.
companies weren't just sitting around waiting for the dust to settle.
Oh, no.
Let's move on to some real-world examples
Yeah, let's get into the nitty-gritty.
of how they navigated
Yeah.
this turbulent period.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start with the agricultural sector.
Okay. We were just talking about how companies had to adapt to all these shifting trade dynamics.
Right.
What are some specific examples of how businesses, especially in industries that were hit really hard by these tariffs, responded to these challenges?
Yeah, well, let's look at the American agricultural sector.
Okay.
You know, China was a massive buyer of American soybeans,
Right.
especially for use in animal feed.
Right.
When those retaliatory tariffs hit, American soybean farmers lost a huge chunk of their export market.
Wow.
And it wasn't just about the lost sales.
Right.
There was a massive surplus of soybeans in the U.S.
Right.
that led to plummeting prices.
Wow.
Some farmers were forced to sell their crops at a loss,
Wow.
and many struggled to stay afloat.
So it wasn't just
Yeah.
hypothetical economic theory.
Oh, no.
This had real world consequences
Absolutely.
for people's livelihood.
It had real impact.
What about the automotive industry? How did they grapple with these tariffs,
Right.
given how globalized their supply chains are?
The auto industry is a perfect example of how interconnected the global economy is.
Right.
You've got your car manufacturers here in the U.S.,
Right.
but a lot of the parts they need, like steel and aluminum, are coming from other countries.
Right.
So when the Trump administration slapped these tariffs on those materials, it created a ripple effect throughout the entire industry.
Right, because suddenly those American car manufacturers are facing higher costs for these essential parts.
Exactly.
And they can't just eat that cost entirely.
They have a couple of options. Either they eat into their profit margins,
Right.
which isn't sustainable long term,
Right.
or they pass those costs on to the consumer.
Right.
Guess what happened?
Yeah, car prices went up.
Car prices went up.
Yeah.
Studies at the time estimated that the tariffs added an average of $1,000 to the price of a new vehicle in the U.S.
That's a pretty significant increase.
Yeah.
Especially for something as big of a purchase as a car.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because the whole point of this was to protect American jobs.
Right.
But it seems like in the auto industry, it had the opposite effect.
You're right. The irony is that while some steel and aluminum producers here in the U.S. might have seen a temporary boost, those gains were offset by job losses in other parts of the auto industry.
Yeah.
Some manufacturers even started exploring automation more aggressively to offset those rising costs, which could lead to further job displacement in the long run.
So these tariffs weren't just about economics. They were about social and political implications as well.
Oh, absolutely. And it's important to remember these tariffs didn't just affect huge corporations.
Right.
Small businesses across all kinds of sectors were caught in the crossfire. Think about a small furniture maker who suddenly has to pay more for imported wood, or a local clothing boutique dealing with increased cost for fabric sourced from overseas. Those costs add up. And it makes it harder for these small businesses to compete.
It really highlights how everything is interconnected.
Absolutely.
And how policies that might be aimed at a specific thing can have these far-reaching consequences.
Yeah.
Are there any other examples that sort of illustrate these unintended consequences?
Yeah. The tech industry offers a particularly compelling example.
Okay.
Think about all the electronic components that go into a smartphone or a laptop.
Yeah.
Many of these components, especially semiconductors, are being sourced from China.
Right.
When tariffs hit those imports, it increased costs for American tech companies, making them less competitive against their global rivals.
That makes sense, because if your production cost is higher, you either have to raise prices, which could hurt your sales, or accept lower profit margins, which could hurt your ability to invest and innovate.
Absolutely.
So it's this tricky balancing act.
It is a very tricky balancing act. Yeah. And in some cases, these tariffs even accelerated the trend of companies moving production out of the U.S. altogether.
Right.
Some tech companies, for example, started exploring options to shift manufacturing to countries like Vietnam or India, where labor costs were lower, and they could avoid those tariffs.
So these tariffs didn't just like disrupt the existing supply chains.
Right.
They actually encouraged the creation of new ones.
Yeah, new ones emerge.
What about the broader impact on the global trading system?
Yeah.
Did these tariffs fundamentally change the rules of the game?
They definitely shook things up, you have to remember. For decades, the global trading system has been operating under a set of rules and norms, many of which are overseen by the World Trade Organization.
Right, the WTO?
The WTO. The WTO is supposed to be the referee, making sure trade flows smoothly and fairly.
Right.
But when countries start imposing tariffs unilaterally, it undermines that system and creates uncertainty.
Right, because suddenly everybody's like, wait, are these tariffs temporary?
Right.
Will other countries retaliate?
Yeah. What does this mean for the future of global trade?
Yeah.
And that uncertainty can make businesses hesitant to invest, can lead to volatility in financial markets, and can ultimately hurt global economic growth.
It's this reminder that even though we talk about countries or regions as distinct economic entities, really everything is interconnected.
Everything is interconnected.
What happens in one part of the world can have these ripple effects across the whole system.
Exactly. And one of the most significant shifts we saw as a result of these tariffs was the diversification of supply chains.
Right.
As we mentioned earlier, companies started looking for alternative sources of goods outside of China to avoid those tariffs.
Yeah.
This led to increased investment in countries like Vietnam, India, and Mexico, as businesses sought to spread their risk and reduce their dependence on a single supplier.
So in a way, these tariffs, which were intended to bring manufacturing back to the U.S., might have actually accelerated the shift of production to other parts of the world.
Yeah, that was one of the unintended consequences that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And it's a reminder that economic policies, especially in a globalized world, rarely have simple or straightforward outcomes.
It's all about those unintended consequences, isn't it?
It often is. And to fully understand the impact, we have to look beyond just the economic numbers. And consider the broader geopolitical implications as well.
And that's where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
How did China, the primary target of these tariffs, respond to all of these challenges? Did they just kind of sit back and take it? Or did they make strategic moves of their own?
Well, China's a major player on the global stage. They certainly weren't going to stand idly by. They recognized the potential threat posed by these tariffs and responded with a mix of retaliatory measures and strategic initiatives.
Okay, so let's unpack those responses a little bit.
Yeah.
What were some of the key actions that China took to kind of counter these tariffs?
One of their immediate responses was, as we discussed, to impose their own tariffs on American goods. They strategically targeted products like soybeans and pork, which were major exports from states that were politically important to the Trump administration.
So it was a bit of a tit for tat,
yeah,
with each side trying to inflict economic pain on the other.
Exactly. But beyond those retaliatory measures, China also made some strategic moves to reduce their dependence on the U.S. market and strengthen their position in the global economy.
What were some of those strategic moves? I'm curious to hear how they tried to navigate this new trade landscape.
One of their key strategies was to aggressively pursue new trade agreements and partnerships with other countries. They strengthened ties with the European Union, deepened economic cooperation with countries in Southeast Asia, and even expanded their Belt and Road Initiative, which is this massive infrastructure project aimed at connecting China to markets across Asia, Africa, and Europe.
So it's almost like they were saying, okay, if the U.S. doesn't want to play ball, we'll find other partners.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
They recognize that relying too heavily on the U.S. market could make them vulnerable.
Yeah.
So they sought to diversify their trading relationships and build new alliances. And in doing so, they positioned themselves to potentially benefit from a shift in the global balance of power.
That's fascinating. So while the Trump administration was focused on containing China's economic rise, these tariffs might have actually accelerated China's efforts to become a more influential player.
It's a key takeaway from this deep dive. It's often difficult to predict the long-term consequences of economic policies, especially in a complex and interconnected world. Actions intended to achieve one outcome can often lead to unintended and sometimes even opposite results.
It's a reminder that we need to think carefully about the potential second and third order effects.
Absolutely.
It's not always as simple as us versus them in the global economy.
Exactly. And to fully understand the legacy of these tariffs, we need to look beyond the immediate impacts and consider the broader ripple effects they've had on the global trading system, the balance of power between nations, and even the future of globalization itself.
That's a perfect segue into the final part of our deep dive. We've explored those immediate shockwaves, the real-world consequences, the strategic responses. But now let's turn our attention to the long-term implications. What might the legacy of these tariffs be?
That's where things get really interesting. Let's start by considering the potential long-term impact on the U.S. economy.
We've been unpacking the complexities of Trump's tariffs, from those initial price hikes to the reshuffling of global supply chains.
It's been a wild ride.
It has. But now in this final part, I'm really curious about the long-term consequences. Like, what's the lasting impact of all of this, and how might this reshape the future of global trade?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that economists and political scientists are still debating. One of the most significant potential outcomes is a relative decline in U.S. economic influence.
That's interesting.
We
were just talking about how China was strategically making moves to diversify its trading partners and reduce its reliance on the U.S. So in a way, these tariffs might have inadvertently pushed other countries to explore alternatives to, like, the U.S.-led economic order.
Precisely. And as those alternative partnerships and alliances solidify, the U.S. could find itself less central to the global trading system. We're already seeing signs of this with agreements like the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership.
The CPTPP.
The CPTPP.
I remember when the U.S. withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership under the Trump administration. So the CPTPP is essentially like a new trade agreement among all these Pacific Rim countries. But without the U.S., it's almost like a new economic club formed, and the U.S. wasn't invited.
It's a good analogy, and it highlights how these trade tensions can reshape the geopolitical landscape, creating new alliances and potentially shifting the balance of power. And the CPTPP is just one example. China has also been actively strengthening its ties with the European Union and other Asian countries.
So it seems like we're moving toward a more multipolar world where economic power is more distributed among various nations and regions rather than being concentrated in the U.S.
That's a very real possibility. And it's not just about trade agreements. It's also about investment flows, technology development, and even cultural influence. The global landscape is shifting, and these tariffs were a catalyst for some of those shifts.
Okay, so we've got a potential decline in U.S. influence, the rise of new economic blocs, and this shift towards a more multipolar world. What about the institutions that govern global trade? Like the World Trade Organization.
The WTO.
How has the WTO been affected by all of these trade wars?
The WTO has definitely faced challenges in recent years, partly due to these trade tensions. It was designed to be the referee of global trade, ensuring that everyone plays by the rules. But when countries start imposing tariffs unilaterally, it undermines the system and creates uncertainty.
Because if countries can just bypass the WTO and impose tariffs whenever they feel like it, then what's the point of having these rules in the first place?
It's like the referee losing control of the game.
Exactly. And one of the key mechanisms within the WTO that's been strained is the dispute settlement system. This is the process by which countries can challenge each other's trade practices and seek a resolution. But as countries have increasingly resorted to unilateral actions and retaliatory tariffs, the dispute settlement system has become bogged down.
It has.
So it's almost like these trade wars have exposed some of the weaknesses and limitations of the existing global trading system.
That's a fair assessment, and it raises important questions about how the system needs to adapt to the realities of a more complex and interconnected world.
It sounds like a call for reform.
It is.
Is there a sense that these challenges might actually lead to positive changes in the long run?
Yeah.
Could we see like a more effective and equitable global trading system?
There's certainly potential for that. You know, the current rules, many of which were established decades ago, may no longer adequately address the complexities of 21st century global trade, the rise of e-commerce, the increasing importance of intellectual property, and the growing concerns about sustainability, all require a fresh look at how we govern global trade.
So it's almost like an opportunity to hit the reset button and create a system that's more adaptable and responsive to the challenges of today's world.
That's one way to look at it. And it's going to require a lot of dialogue and cooperation among nations. We need to find solutions that benefit all parties involved, not just a select few.
It sounds like a call for global economic diplomacy.
Yeah.
But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to bring it back to our listener. You know, we've explored all these complex issues and potential long-term consequences. But what does it all mean for you, the person listening to this right now? Why should you care about these trade wars and their implications?
That's a great question. And it's easy to feel disconnected from these seemingly distant economic battles. But the reality is that the decisions made by governments and businesses in the realm of international trade have a direct impact on your daily life.
Because we're all consumers. And those tariffs that we talked about at the beginning, those translate into higher prices for everything. From cars to electronics to groceries.
Everything.
It affects our wallets directly.
Exactly. And it's not just about prices. These trade tensions can also impact job security, investment opportunities, and even the availability of certain goods and services.
It's a reminder that even though these issues might seem abstract or far removed from our everyday lives, they actually touch upon the most fundamental aspects of our well-being.
Absolutely. And in a world that's becoming increasingly interconnected, it's more important than ever to understand these dynamics.
So as we conclude our deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought to ponder. We've discussed the potential for a decline in U.S. economic influence, the rise of new economic blocs, and the need for reforming the global trading system. But what if these shifts ultimately lead to a more multipolar world? Where power is more evenly distributed among various nations and regions? What opportunities and challenges might such a world present?
That's a great question.
That's something to think about as you continue to explore the ever-evolving landscape of global trade and geopolitics.
And remember, the future is not predetermined. The choices we make today, both individually and collectively, will shape the world of tomorrow. So stay informed, stay engaged, and keep asking those thought-provoking questions.
That's a wrap on our deep dive into Trump's tariffs.
Oh, that's great.
Until next time, keep exploring.